rejection is a necessary byproduct of the whole process. It's definitely not personal, and it happens to everybody.
Welcome to the SOOPR podcast, designed for medical trainees looking to take time out of training for a clinical research fellowship in the UK. Each week, we'll bring you a 15-minute discussion with a leading expert in the UK medical research process, or from a successful research fellow sharing what they wish they'd known before they'd taken their time out. I'm your host, Nikhil Alawalia, and on behalf of the British Junior Cardiology Association and with support from the BHF Clinical Research Collaborative, we're proud to bring you this series. We are very lucky to be joined by Dr Upasana Tayal. She graduated from Oxford University to take up an academic foundation post in the Oxford Deanery. This is where she first became involved in academic research, completing her initial work in cardiac MRI, a field she later returned to in 2014 when she undertook an MRC Clinical Research Training Fellowship in cardiac imaging and the genetics of dilated cardiomyopathy. This was at the NIHR Cardiovascular Biomedical Research Unit based at the Royal Brompton Hospital and Imperial College London. For her high-impact work on using CMR imaging and genetics to risk stratify patients with DCM, she was awarded 2 Young Investigator Awards by the London Cardiac Society and the American College of Cardiology. So, Dr. Tayal, thank you so much for joining us this evening and giving up your time.
A pleasure, Nikhil, and thanks so much for the invitation. I think what you're setting out to do is super impressive, and I think it'll be really valuable, and I wish I had something like this when I was starting out. It's a pleasure.
So I want to start by asking about supervisors. I think it's such a difficult process to identify the individual supervisor, but also the team who are going to be such a big part of your life for 3 to 4 years. How did you try and figure out who would be the right fit for you?
So I think 2 things. One is read widely and attend lots of conferences and meetings, because, just to see people a few years ahead of you and then also many years ahead of you, and see who's producing groups, who's producing research and papers from which groups you think you want to be a part of, or the research that you think you want to be a part of. But the second part of that is really just to meet people and have lots of conversations, and not just meet the principal investigator. I think that's really important. And I didn't do this so much for the foundation program, but definitely for PhD. Meet the fellows in that group, okay? Meet the current fellows, try and get a feel for where the previous fellows have gone, and do they look happy? So does everybody in the group look like they're having a good time doing their research? And I don't mean necessarily jetting off loads of conferences, but do they speak well of their supervisor? And generally people will tell you, peer to peer, what things are like, and you get a really good feel of it. And figuring out what's happened to previous fellows is also a really good indication of whether you're likely to be able to complete your research, what they go on to be. And they won't all necessarily stay in academic medicine, because that's quite normal, but did they have a positive and productive time? And I think that's a really useful insight, as well as speaking to the actual big person who I knew would be a good fit for me. And that is particularly a nurturing sort of, someone who's around and visible, as opposed to someone who's necessarily away a lot. And I knew I definitely needed that sort of environment.
Yeah,
it worked out really well. I won't obviously name any names, but I did also speak to various people in other groups where and things that are just different for different people, but the balance of service commitment during a PhD, for example, was just in the wrong direction, and some fellows had really struggled with that, or particular PIs being never really visible on the ground, and so they were left in the hands of a postdoc, or things like that. And you hear those things happening quite a lot, and they can work for some people. I just knew it wasn't going to work for me.
I think I want to touch on the idea of rejection and resilience as far as you're comfortable to talk about.
Yeah, and I think these are really important topics, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about them, about the resilience needed in academic medicine, and just a couple of key themes around that. And one of them is rejection. And when was it? I had my Wellcome Trust interview, and I think when I found out I didn't get it, and it was the Tony Newman-Taylor, who was then the head of research at the NHLI, rang up my supervisor and said, "Such a shame, we think she's brilliant, but it will be very valuable learning for her academic resilience and her academic career going forwards." And at the time I was like, well, that's very annoying. But actually I kind of know what he means now, and it's really disappointing, and it's hugely frustrating, particularly, with grants and papers when you put in a huge amount of work. but really it's just, rejection is just part and parcel of the academic process, and it's the nature of the beast, because not everything can get published everywhere, and not everybody can get money for everything all the time, because there has to be the process involved. So the process, the peer review and all of that has its frustrations, and I can rant about that separately at another day. But in terms of what it means for you as an individual, and particularly an early career or an early stage researcher, is that it's really important to remember that, to just pin that on the wall, and remember that rejection is a necessary byproduct of the whole process. It's definitely not personal, and it happens to everybody. And it's really easy to lose your confidence in the early stages when it happens to you, because I think with clinical medicine, it's a very different kettle of fish. You generally go through a series of processes and hoops and stages. You sort of know where you're going next, you know what you need to do to get there. And as long as you work hard enough, you'll probably get through and everything will be okay. Academia is completely different. You could work as hard as you like and as hard as you possibly could work and put everything into it, but you may still not get to where you want to go to. And that's just a really different mindset to get your head around.
I mean, that's a very mature and sensible way to think about it now. But if I could take you back to when you got that email or letter from MRC, I mean, how long did that affect you, and what did you do? I mean, how long did it take for you to pick yourself up again and go back for another grant?
So what I had done at the time was, which I don't know for sure is necessarily the best approach for everybody, but I had submitted fairly concurrently to Welcome and MRC. So I knew I had another shot, but then I hadn't submitted anywhere else. So I felt like a lot was riding on this. But some people recommend that you submit consecutively so you have a chance to improve your application before the next approach. But then that makes what's already a long lead time even longer. But yeah, it's hugely gutting, because particularly with fellowship applications, it takes, as I said, months and months, if not years, to write these things or to get everything together. So it's hugely disappointing, and it's really hard to not take it personally, particularly at the beginning. Now I'm, however many years down the road from that early stage, and I think a bit more sanguine about it.
Who did you look to for support?
It's really important to have a good team around you, and I don't just mean upwards with your supervisor, but I mean a really good peer support team. And that can either be like formal or informal, either people in your group or just people who are registrars coming up with you who are going through exactly the same thing. Yeah. There was a few of us going through it all, at the same time, and a few people ahead of me had I think very similar experiences, rejected by Welcome, and then they got their MRC fellowship, and actually just hearing about that sort of normalizes it, and it makes it just something that happens rather than something that has happened to me in particular. But you're so right, because I think fellowships are a bit more personal, whereas papers, I think it's a lot easier, certainly for me, to separate that from, because that doesn't feel like it's so much of a rejection of me. It feels like it's, the science overall. Yeah. You're right. I think fellowships are a little bit more personal.
Sure. So I guess moving through the PhD, when was the next time you experienced any sort of big challenge, rejection, something like that you felt really tested?
So I think the next big challenge is really the change in mindset from clinical medicine to academia. And one of the really big things is that research just takes time. And in clinical medicine, particularly cardiology, which is a very busy sort of hyper-acute specialty, things don't take time, right? You make your decisions there and then. Generally, you assess your primary patient definitely, in minutes. But even when you were in clinic, you generally make your plan that clinic that day. Definitely on the wards, you'll know whether your plan's working or not, your management, over a course of days. Research is a completely different kettle of fish. You could do things and make your plans, as it were, or do your research, or get the ball rolling, but you may not see any results or any output for months and months. And in some cases, when you're doing longitudinal follow-up studies, it could be years. Yeah. And so it's really hard, particularly at the beginning, when I certainly found it particularly challenging, having come from at that stage a really busy DGH post. to academia, and I was like, at some point I was like, you're going to pay me to read papers all day? It just didn't seem to make sense that this was now what I did and my role. So that definitely took a bit of adjusting to. And I don't think I necessarily figured it all out at the time, but the advice that I would give now would be to build in early or easy wins. And by that, I mean, busy yourself with other things like writing a review article, because you can use some of that content for your introduction in your thesis later, perhaps, or see if there are any existing data sets in your group that somebody just hasn't had the time to analyze. And any busy research group will have lots of these, so little pots of data that a fellow previously was meant to get around to but just ran out of time before the end of their thesis, or other bits, or somebody who's currently in the group who just doesn't have the bandwidth to do something, and make yourself available for things like that, because I think you can then sort of fairly quickly start working on your analysis skills and writing, and all the while doing your primary project. And actually you'll be really surprised, you never quite know where things lead you. And I know plenty of people for whom their these sort of early win projects that weren't really meant to be their main research, have actually gone on to be much more productive than whatever they intended to do to start with. So it's definitely, those are my two pieces of advice, is that research takes time, so find some early wins.
Moving later on into your academic career, I imagine that comes up again when you're submitting papers, because you're not always going to get into your first choice journal. How have you how do you process that sort of rejection now?
It's still really annoying. I can't cushion it. It doesn't affect me, and I don't take it personally. I just find it intensely annoying. And I, in the process of a lot of ranting to lots of people about it over the years, I have actually come to realize that generally all of that will make things better for wherever it's going to end up. And my supervisor often talks about, we didn't get into whatever journal here, but that meant that we got a JAMA paper later, or whatever. There's examples. So yeah, every bit of feedback is useful. I wouldn't say you have to take it all on board, but consider it and make it better. It does just get easier. And I had a conversation with my training program director about this, Darryl Francis. He says the way that you've got to think about papers is like little soldiers going off to war, and that you really hope that they return, but they may not. And that's okay.
Coming to the end now, if you had to give a final piece of advice, or I suppose a first piece of advice to yourself, going back all the way to the time, let's say before you even applied, or as you were writing your applications for your PhD, what would you say is like the golden piece of advice to give yourself?
It'll all be all right.
Yeah. Great. So I think we'll leave it there, and thanks very much for giving up your time. I think that's been fantastic, and I'm sure will be incredibly useful to the doctors who listen. Next time on the podcast.
There is no curriculum, right? So when I started, I was thinking, what am I supposed to do? And what the hell's a PhD for? How do I get a PhD? I didn't even know what a PhD was.
I sit down with Dr. George Collins, a Wellcome Trust Clinical Research Training Fellow at the University College London. He discusses the transition from clinical cardiology to a bench-side research project in immunology, and also his pragmatic approach to taking time out of training and finding the right research team.